Going live. Good morning. Sorry, I'm running a couple minutes behind schedule. My settings were taking a little longer than usual to set up, but now here we are back with a double chapter day of Breadcrumbs. It's fine, nobody's here yet anyhow. So if you come in a minute, just don't watch the first 15 seconds of this video and you'll be fine. Today we have a short chapter and then a medium long chapter. So it's my favorite kind of day, a double chapter day, which means that I should probably just go ahead and get started so we don't waste any more time, huh? Are you ready? Did you buckle your seatbelts? Are you set up for chapter 13 of Breadcrumbs? Chapter 13, Splinters. Once upon a time, a demon-like creature, I remember him. This was Mal from a couple chapters ago, the guy who made this horrible mirror that showed the worst in everything and made things terrible. Okay. Once upon a time, a demon-like creature with a 47-syllable name made an enchanted mirror. The mirror shattered in the sky. The splinters took to the wind and scattered for hundreds of miles. When they fell to the earth, things began to change. You might be swimming in a lake and come upon a spot that is cold and murky and it feels like you've swum through a ghost. You might be walking in a grassy field and find a hard bit of dirt where nothing grows. You might be in a forest and find yourself in a patch of silence as if no birds dare sing there. This is where the splinters fell. Some went into the sand, and that sand became glass again, and that glass became all kinds of things, creating mischief beyond what even Mal could have imagined. A woman got a new pair of eyeglasses. She left her husband the next day. She told him that she needed to find herself, but it was a lie. It was like I was seeing him through new eyes, she told a friend. The president of a small corporation had a bathroom with a mirror installed just off his office. Good morning. Within a week, he confessed to dumping chemicals in a nearby river. Within 2 weeks, he'd resigned and spent the rest of his days in a small cabin writing confessional poetry. An astronomer looked through his new telescope into the stars one morning and then refused to ever look into the heavens again. When questioned, he said, "Some things we are better off not knowing." No one who tried on clothes in the third dressing room to the right of a certain department store ever bought anything. One observant employee suggested the room might be haunted. She was fired. Every person who bought a particular model of television came to believe that TV shows had become particularly mean-spirited of late, and they all canceled their cable and took to other hobbies. A certain shiny new subdivision featured windows made of the most state-of-the-art material. The neighbors peek out the window through closed curtains and keep to themselves. Most of the splinters that fell were as tiny as dust, but there were a few larger pieces as well. The biggest one was about the size of your hand. It fell near the woods, and a woman picked it up and carried it in with her. She dropped it when the wolves scared her, and it was picked up several days later by a girl who lived nearby. This girl did not need an enchanted mirror to show her that the world could be an ugly place, so to her it spoke the truth. She kept the mirror in her apron pocket where it could be secret and safe. A boy got a splinter in his eye, and his heart turned cold. Only 2 people noticed. One was a witch, and she took him for her own. The other was his best friend. And she went after him in ill-considered shoes, brave and completely unprepared. Part 2. Chapter 14, Into the Woods. Hazel stepped into the woods gingerly, expecting to land in a thick cushion of snow. So she stumbled when her foot went all the way to solid ground. It was not winter in the woods, at least in these woods. She stood, rooted to the spot like the mammoth trees that surrounded her. Dark trunks traveled up into the distant sky, connecting this world to the one above. The distant roof was a tangle of budding branches. Decaying leaves clung fiercely to the floor among tiny green sprouts that aspired to the world above. A cloud of mist hung in the sky like the after effects of a spell. The air was a tangible thing, rushing into Hazel's lungs as she breathed, touching her skin like a curious ghost. It carried with it the smell of old leaves and wide open sky. She was in the wood at the end of the world, or perhaps at the beginning. She looked behind her to remind herself of the place she came from, but it was gone. The wood stretched out in every direction. It was as if she had sprouted there. She had stepped into the woods in the park and landed in an entirely different place. She knew this might happen. She'd been to Narnia, Wonderland, Hogwarts, Dictionopolis. She had tessered, fallen through the rabbit hole, crossed the ice bridge into the unknown world beyond. Hazel knew this world, and it should have made this easier, but it did not. Hazel shuddered. She couldn't get out even if she wanted to. But it didn't matter. She didn't want to get out, not now anyway. She had a job to do. Hazel took a deep breath and was about to step forward when some primal instinct made her turn her head to the left. And when she did, she desperately wished she had a place to run to, for about 10 yards away, next to one of the trees, was a large gray wolf. Hazel froze. The wolf sat erect and still like a statue. His copper eyes gazed at her. She instinctively took a step backward, and still he stared. Panic fused the circuits of her brain. Her breath stopped. She'd read once that if you ran into a bear in the woods, you should avoid eye contact and you shouldn't run away. But all she knew about wolves was that you should never tell them how to find your grandmother's house. So Hazel lowered her eyes and took another step back, her skin crawling and her heart buzzing with fright. The wolf blinked, and in all the stillness it was as if he had leapt toward her. But he hadn't. He just stayed, regarding her, and his gaze was the world. "Hi," she croaked. Nothing. "I'm just looking for my friend. I don't mean any harm." Stare. Maybe you've seen him? His name's Jack. He's got freckles and a blue coat. He was with a woman on a sleigh, a witch or an elf, dressed all in white." Blink. "Well, I should be going then." Hazel took one step back, then another, and then moving as slowly as possible, she turned around and began to walk away from the wolf. It was all she could do not to take off and run as fast as she could. Her every muscle begged to be sprung. She wondered whether she would hear him as he approached, or if the next thing she knew would be the jaws on her neck, then searing pain, and then nothing. But neither thing happened, and she carefully stole a look behind her to see the wolf still at his post and still watching her. She crept on for an eternity, one foot in front of the other, grateful for each and every breath. Finally, when she was well out of his sight, she leaned up against one of the trees and let out a great shaking exhale. The feeling of his eyes on her had not left her. It seemed like it would never go away, that she would spend the rest of her life feeling that predatory gaze. She closed her eyes and gathered herself. Find Jack, that was all. She looked around for some direction, some guidance, some place. There was a clearing up ahead, and it was, at least, a destination. Hazel moved softly toward it, conscious of advertising her presence with every step to all the watchful wolves of the woods. Not that everything was silent. The wind carried whisperings with it, a current of noise just underneath the airy quiet. She listened, her ears learning how to work in this new world, and she could hear the sounds of birds chirping and trilling, and this was somehow comforting, normal. There were birds in the woods, and they had things to sing of. There was another noise in the wind, too, something that didn't seem normal, at least not here. As Hazel continued to walk forward, the sound clarified, and she had to stop to take in what she was hearing. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. Hazel shook her head slightly at the strangeness of it, this once ordinary sound that in the mist-filled forest felt like a mechanical menace. She moved toward the sound, the ticks marking out her steps, and she realized it was coming from the clearing. And then she saw why. The clearing was about the size of the first floor of Hazel's house, and at the very center of it was a clock. It was a tall, standing clock with a gold-trimmed face at the top like a head, supported by 2 steel beams. 3 cylindrical weights hung down from behind the face, and a long pendulum swung back and forth over the ground. Behind the face, you could see gears and cranks. It looked like a grandfather clock that had been skinned. The clock was only about a foot taller than she was, and as she stared up into its face as if to have a conversation. In the woods, the sun was rising in the sky, but the iron hands pronounced the time as 5:43, probably about the time it was back in the real world. And that seemed the weirdest thing of all. There was a squawking from above, followed by an odd croaking, then some sort of throaty trilling, and Hazel looked up to see 2 big black birds perched on a branch behind her, chattering to each other. The birds were the size of eagles and pitch black, with long, hooked black beaks. They looked like crows, but puffier and shinier and much, much bigger. Ravens. The word popped into Hazel's head. The bigger one turned its head toward her and looked back at her with beady black eyes, taking her in. Hazel shifted under its gaze, and it turned to its partner and croaked something. They chattered back and forth, and Hazel understood that they were talking about her. She took a deep breath. "I'm Hazel," she said. "I lost my friend. Do you know of a woman who looks like she's made out of snow?" She felt like Alice questioning caterpillars and grinning cats. "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" The birds both turned their heads to look at her, and she stood in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by tree giants, while two of the dog-sized maybe ravens eyeballed her, and a naked clock ticked on behind her like fate. And she felt quite small and quite real, and wondered what she thought she was doing and what she was going to do now. And then one of the birds lifted its head slightly, focusing on a point somewhere beyond Hazel. She turned to follow its gaze and saw, leading out of the clearing, a small path. She looked back at the birds. The smaller one croaked something at her and flicked its head toward the path again, and then they turned back to each other. They were done with her. Now, Hazel was not stupid. She knew that just because you see a piece of cake and a sign that says "Eat me" doesn't mean you should actually do it. And just because two giant ravens point you in the direction of a path doesn't mean you should take it. But it was the only path she had. Hazel crossed the clearing and stood in front of the path. It didn't look like anything out of the ordinary, just trodden dirt weaving around the trees. She took off her hat, mittens, scarf, and green jacket and put them in her backpack, then took out her compass because it seemed like the thing to do. Her mom would be pleased. Hazel might have plunged into a mysterious fantasy woods after an evil witch with a pack of wolves at her disposal, but at least she'd brought a compass. Hazel watched the face of the compass as the needle wavered slightly, as if afraid to make too firm a commitment. But it was pointing roughly the way she was heading. Hazel was going north. Her heart lifted a little. This might be a magic woods, but there was still a north here. It was a place like any other. The compass would guide her to Jack and then guide her home. Who needed breadcrumbs? She had a compass. She had a direction. She had a path. She knew where north was. So Hazel stepped on the path and headed forward. Last year, her class had taken a field trip through the woods in some state park or other. There was a guide who taught them how to spot poison ivy and look for water and find shelter, but Hazel had been too busy dreaming of centaurs to pay attention. The only thing she remembered was the guide passing out whistles and showing everyone how to blow 3 times for an emergency signal. The whole class practiced again and again while the guide whipped them up into a whistling frenzy. Hazel had been afraid they would scare off the centaurs. She had the wilderness kit whistle in her backpack and now could not imagine why. Because whatever the emergency was that might cause her to blow the whistle, there was no saying that whatever answered it wouldn't be far worse. It would be just the thing that allowed the Snow Queen's flying monkeys to find her. Flying snow monkeys, probably. The path led Hazel up an incline, and now she was moving along a ridge above the ravine. From somewhere down below, she could hear a stream running. In another world, she was on a field trip surrounded by all her old classmates. The guide was yammering on about potentially useful information, while Hazel dreamt of magic. It was then she realized that the tick-tock sound of the clock had never quieted. It was as if she was still standing next to it. She stopped for a moment and looked around as if maybe she hadn't moved at all. But she had. And yet there was the sound. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Hazel stiffened. It made no sense. When she'd entered the woods, she hadn't heard it at all, and it had gotten louder as she approached it. This was the way things worked. Now that it was in her ears, though, it seemed it would never go away. She took a deep breath and moved on, her feet walking in rhythm with the clock. After some time, she came upon a fork in the path. Hazel looked from one side to the other and bit her lip, then consulted the compass. One was heading north and one eastward. Hazel was looking for a witch made of snow with a sleigh pulled by wolves. She would go north. She walked on, consulting the compass when she needed to, always heading the direction it pointed. She was just thinking how odd it was that there was no one else in the woods when she felt a shaking on the ground and heard hoofbeats in the distance. They were coming toward her. Hazel stopped and looked behind her, but could see nothing. She did not know these woods. She did not know the rules. She did not know what manner of man patrolled the paths. All she knew was her job, and that was to get Jack and get out. Clutching the precious compass, Hazel left the path and scurried into the trees to hide. She ducked behind a particularly wide one and slowly peeked around to see who else was in the woods. The hoofbeats approached, and the ground beneath Hazel vibrated in response. Hazel moved her head out as far as she dared. A man was on the path, riding a sturdy chestnut horse. The man was wearing a flannel shirt and a cloth hat. On one side of the horse hung a saddlebag and a long, old-fashioned axe. Hazel understood. He was a woodsman. In a woods full of wolves, there were woodsmen too. Her heart eased. The horse made a noise and stopped suddenly, pawing the ground with its hoof. The woodsman whispered something to it and patted its flank. He reached into his saddlebag and began rummaging inside it. Something seemed to catch his attention then, and he looked around, eyes searching the trees. Hazel darted back, then wondered if she needed to. Maybe he could help her. She peeked out again, and the woodsman's posture changed. He was erect, watchful. One hand held taut the reins of the horse, who was stomping agitatedly, and another clutched the handle of the axe. Hazel felt the expectant hush in the air, like the trees were waiting for something. If she took a breath, the sound would shatter the silence. And then the horse let out a noise, and the woodsman relaxed his grip on the axe and lifted the reins. Her heart pounded. She'd asked a wolf and two ravens about the woman in white. It might be time to ask an actual person. She gathered herself and stepped out from the tree. There, standing between her and the path, where a moment before had been nothing, was another wolf. This one was bigger than the first, with a thick brown and black coat and creepy blue eyes. Hazel froze. She heard the sound of the horse stirring. The wolf was in the shadows, too, far behind the man for him. In the shadows, too far behind the man for him to see. And the creature had no interest in him at all. All its energy was fixed on her. Hazel could scream. There was a wolf and a woodcutter with an axe. This was the way the story went. She didn't know how long it took a woodcutter to hear a yell, understood what it meant, and then unhook his axe and swing, and how that compared to the time it took a wolf to cross the distance between desire and prey. The scream came out lighter. That's the wrong page. The scream came out as a strangled, whispered thing, the sort that could barely bother the air. She tried again. The word mustered inside her, air swirled around in her lungs, her vocal cords vibrated, her lips readied. Wolf, Hazel said, but the sound was no more than a breath. And then some change on the wolf's face, a darkening. Its blue eyes flashed, and though he was some distance from her, she saw it like lightning. He lifted his lips, and his face contorted into a snarl, revealing yellow fangs. He growled, and only she heard it. Hazel was nothing. Nothing at all. She would disappear here in the woods, and no one would even know she'd come. The horse whinnied. The rider clucked. The hoofbeats started and began to travel off down the path. The wolf did not move, did not release her, did not ease his fangs. The horse and rider disappeared into the distance, and still Hazel stood. Finally, the wolf relaxed. The cable that tied them together broke. Hazel eyed the wolf, who still stood in front of the path, and then slowly turned her head toward the woods behind her. I'm going to go over there now, she told the wolf. He did not answer. She willed herself forward. She took a step and heard a small plasticky crunch. She stopped. The hand that had been clutched around the compass was empty. She picked up her foot and saw just underneath the cracked remnants of her guide to Jack. Her heart sank. Of course it might still work. It might still point north. She might still be able to use it to get there and even back again. She looked down at the compass for a moment, pictured herself bending down to pick it up. Her neck tingled. She turned to see the wolf pacing on the path now, back and forth like a sentry. Then Hazel noticed something on the path, something that had definitely not been there before. She stared. There in the middle of the path was a pair of shoes. The woodsman must have dropped them. They were not just any shoes. They were girls' shoes, for one, something close to the size of the battered sneakers on Hazel's feet. And they were beautiful, better than the sum of all the shoes Susan had in her closet. Shiny slippers with a pile of long ribbons on top. And they were a bright, beckoning red. They were dancing shoes, real ballet slippers, not just what Adelaide had, but the kind they have in books, the kind where you can wrap the ribbon around your ankles. They were shoes that called to Hazel's heart. They were full of promise, of leaps and pliés and the feeling of being lighter than air. They were not for the woods, but they were for everything after. Hazel took a step toward the shoes and the path, and the wolf stopped and stared and bared his teeth. He was taking those from her too. There was nothing she could do. So, leaving the cracked toy among the leaves and the shoes on the path, she turned around and headed into the trees. Tune back in tomorrow to see what happens with Hazel in chapter 15, Skins. I was so excited for Hazel. I thought she was going to get some help and maybe that she was going to get, the very fancy shoes so she could get her goal of getting actual ballet classes eventually or take one step closer, right? But I guess I'm going to have to find out what that wolf's deal is tomorrow or in another chapter. If you're coming to my Zoom today, the Zoom is at 1 o'clock, and I'll put the link in Google Classroom as soon as I hang up this call. I'm going to be walking through the swag project and how to write a letter, all of that jazz, and I hope to see you there. Bye. See you tomorrow morning.